Welcome, everybody, to the Let Purple Rain podcast. My name is Joe Arpaisi, otherwise known as Purple Rain. I started my work in CFF back in the year of 2008, and after stepping away for 8 years, I returned in 2024 as Purple Rain. You can find all of my content over at letpurplerain.com. You can also follow the podcast on YouTube and Spotify. It'd really help if you gave our new Spotify account a 5-star review, and I would really appreciate that one. But I'd say the most important thing that you could do if you want to get the most up-to-date information about everything going on is to follow me on X. And you can find me at UW underscore purple underscore rain. Excuse me here. Let me get a sip of water already. For any of you that are new to my content, that you've stumbled across me, you're brand new to the work that I do. I just want to go over here what my weekly content schedule is during the regular season here. Monday, I will be putting out waiver wire articles, and on Tuesday, I put out my player rankings. Thursday, I release the podcast, which has the Start Em episodes, and then on Saturday mornings, I put out my player prop spotlight. All premium subscribers to letpurplerain.com get full access to all of this content. Free subscribers or people on YouTube, people on Spotify, they get a limited view. If you're not a premium subscriber, you can sign up to get a free 7-day trial so you can do a test drive of everything that I have to offer over at letpurplerain.com. And here we are on the Let Purple Rain podcast. YouTube and Spotify will be the home of my start-sit suggestions for this week. LetPurpleRain.com will be the exclusive home to where I answer your submitted questions and help you create the best lineup every week on X and on Spotify. I sit there and put out threads asking for your submitted questions. That's another reason why I recommend following me on X, guys. If you want some help with your lineup, you can submit your questions there, and I'll be answering them over at letpurplerain.com. Now that we got that out of the way, let's dive into some college fantasy football. We're going to start off with the quarterbacks here. I'm going to do another sip of water. Appreciate the patience with that, guys. Starting off with the quarterbacks here, and I want to start off with a new popular name from the waiver wire. That is Brandon Lewis, Memphis. He is taking on Florida Atlantic. And Vegas is calling for Memphis to score 37.5 points. To any of you that are brand new to the show, this is your first time listening, or maybe your second time, I'll do a quick reminder here. With all these players, I will review what the score is that Vegas is predicting a player's team to make. And then I also go over 4 advanced stats. Technically 5. I will go over my fantasy matchup grade that I give each one. I will go over either passing. I'll go over how many touchdowns the defense gives up per game, whether that's rushing or passing. I will go over red zone touchdown conversion rate of the defense. So what percentage of the time is that defense giving up touchdowns when the opponents get into the red zone? I will either go over third down conversion rates of the defense if we're talking about pass players, or I will go over yards per carry allowed when we're going over rushing players. These are all stats I like to do. And then for any of you that are watching on YouTube here, for those of you listening to Spotify, I will verbally say this as well, but I like to color code things. So for those of you over on YouTube, dark green is really good. Light green is pretty good. Black is just average. Light red, kind of bad. Dark red, really bad. There's my quick little wrap up here. Jumping back into Brandon Lewis. For fantasy matchup grades, I've given this a B+, which is a pretty good indicator here. And I also like the fact that FAU is giving up 2 passing defensive, excuse me. Woo! Let's try another sip of water here. FAU defense is giving up 2 passing touchdowns per game. That is also a pretty good stat for Brandon Lewis here. The red zone touchdown conversion rate is just kind of average at 55.6%. But the FAU defense is pretty good on third downs. They're only giving up first downs 28.9% of the time, which is kind of bad. So when you go through, you look at all of these numbers on here. I'm going to say this is a good lineup, a good showing for Memphis. One reason I wanted to cover him here, and this is kind of not a traditional, start sit selection for me, but like Lewis was hot last week, but that came with him running for 100 yards. He normally is not getting that level of rushing yardage. I felt like the game itself against Arkansas necessitated him carrying the ball as much as he did. And FAU gives up a lot of yards on the ground. As good as these stats look for passing matchup, it's way better on the ground game. I think Sutton Smith is going to steal a lot of the fantasy production. And, Brandon Lewis maybe is going to get half the amount of rushing yards that you saw last week. So I wanted to bring him up to be kind of a precautionary tale. There's a lot of good things to look at for this matchup. And I do think you can 100% put him in your lineup. But the one thing I just want to caution is you're not going to get the same, you're probably going to see something in the mid 20s, not the mid 30s when it comes to fantasy points from Brandon Lewis. So, you know, this is a cautious here, but I will still say Brandon Lewis, Memphis, stardom. Next one I'm going to bring up here is another hot name, Trinidad Chambliss from Ole Miss. They are taking on LSU, and Vegas is calling on Ole Miss to score 29 points. This one's not as cut and dry here. So it's got another B plus fantasy matchup grade from me, and but that LSU defense, they're only giving up 0.75 touchdowns per game. That's not very good. I do like the fact that if Ole Miss can get in the red zone, they're giving up. Excuse me, LSU is giving up touchdowns 60% of the time. That is pretty good for Ole Miss. But what's also kind of bad though is for them to get down there, they're going to need to sustain drives. LSU is only giving up first downs 24.5% of the time. That's really bad. So we've got this mixture of some, you know, pretty good, kind of good stats, along with a kind of bad and a really bad stat from LSU. And a score from Vegas thinking that Ole Miss is going to score under 30. So this is kind of a tougher one when I'm looking at things here, guys. You've got a hot hand, which I like, which normally you would keep playing. Um, Chambliss isn't a young player. He has games under his belt, but not games like at this level. And, I'm going to apologize, guys. I did not look this up prior, so I'm just going to do it right now on the fly. If you bear with me, I forget where the game's at, so I'm pulling that up. So I do think that can make a big difference here. Let me see here. So LSU, it is at least at the game is at Ole Miss. I would be a little more worried if it was something where he's having to play on the road, at Death Valley at night in this matchup. And when looking at the stats, this is another player too where the rushing matchup is better than the passing matchup this week for Ole Miss. So that luckily Trinidad is good enough of a dual threat guy that he can take advantage of both of these here. Um, this is one that it's so tough because like I said, the stats are down the middle, and I am kind of like sitting on the fence on this one here. Like my first approach, and I try and pick guys that I think are unique and interesting that for the main show here, guys that a lot of might be having thoughts about, and I the first thing I just want to point out, if you have someone else that looks like they've got a decent matchup, whether it's one quarterback or two other quarterbacks, depending on how many you have to start in your league. If that's the case, then I would recommend to sit Trinidad out of caution. Um, where my worry comes in here is that I don't think he has that high of a ceiling, and I don't know quite how low his floor is going to be here. So if you know that you got better options and you could afford to leave him on the bench, I would tell you to sit him. If the guys on the bench are very wishy-washy, um, if you go over to letpurplerain.com and you've looked at my rankings and they're not, they're right in that same range as Trinidad, then I would say go ahead and play Trinidad. Obviously, each individual one, if you're trying to do a start sit sort of a question thing, that's why I do the the threads on X, the threads on Substack. If that this should have been a week that, like, I think if you had Trinidad and other guys that are kind of similar to him, you should have been submitting your questions with him about him to me. I did not get any Trinidad questions this week, so I want to say, if you've got the talent on your roster, my recommend for Trinidad Chambliss from Ole Miss, I'm going to say sit him. If you don't have a lot of depth on your roster, I would say ride the hot hand, but expect a lower ceiling if you start Trinidad. So like I said, I'm kind of I'm sitting on the fence on this one, but this is really the best way I can kind of evaluate him this week. All right, our last guy that we're going to talk about is Caden Veltkamp from FAU. He is going up against Memphis. So, for if you're only listening on Spotify, you can't see the fact that the graphic I have on the screen for our YouTube viewers is bookended here with the quarterbacks from this Memphis FAU game. Kind of another reason why I picked these two. I find them interesting to look at here, and very popular players as well. Vegas is calling on FAU to only score 24 and a half points, 3 touchdowns. Um, this is just barely kind of a B minus fantasy matchup grade for me. I think it's one of those, like, it could be a C plus, but also I could see this as um, garbage points. Playing in garbage time and having to sling the ball a lot, which I do think could kind of help Veltkamp. Things are between the lines of this B minus grade for the fantasy matchup, but I'm not a fan of the rest of this one. The way that this game looks. Yes, Memphis is coming off of a big win. Could have a letdown game. I do see a lot of that, but the thing I've noticed when I look at these advanced stats, anytime I see someone play Memphis all year, is that they've been good all year. Like, they've been good for Memphis's defense. Let me clarify that. They've been good for the Memphis defense, and I've been going, but they haven't played anybody yet. Well, they just played a really good offense in Arkansas, and these stats are still really good. I think this defense is legit, and the only stat that is just average for Veltkamp in this matchup is that Memphis is giving up touchdowns 50% of the time in the red zone. That's the only average number. Every other number is kind of bad for Veltkamp here. Um, Giving up 0.75 passing touchdowns per game, third down conversion rate of 28.9%. You know, I have a feeling FAU, they're going to struggle a bit. It's not going to be as clean of a matchup as you're going to want. And like I said, I think Memphis has a great matchup for running the ball. I think that Memphis can just grind the ball out and limit the amount of opportunities that Veltkamp has in this one. So when it comes to Caden Veltkamp, Florida Atlantic, I'm going to say sit him. All right, now that we're over at the wide receivers, I've taken another sip of water, and I got three interesting names here that I wanted to throw out for everybody. The first one, I want to start off with Jeremiah Love from Notre Dame. He's been on a hot streak, and he is taking on Arkansas, coming off of that loss to Memphis. Nice little transition there. I got Vegas calling on Notre Dame to score 34.5 points. And talking about Jeremiah Love, part of why he's been on fire is they're finally feeding him the football. I don't know why they weren't doing this earlier, trying to play cutesy ball, but we're now seeing the Jeremiah Love I expected to see in the preseason. And I've got a fantasy matchup grade of a B plus here. I really like the way that I think Notre Dame should have no problem running the football in Arkansas. Arkansas is only giving up 1.75 rushing touchdowns per game. That number was a bad number for fantasy matchups until they played Memphis. So one game against Memphis, well, and I'll take that back. They played Memphis and Mississippi. So I'm going to stop myself there. Um, it's an average number. I do think that Notre Dame will exploit that. Notre Dame's going to get at least 2 rushing touchdowns in this game, guys. I guess they're probably going to get 4 in this game. Definitely 3. So even though we have an average number for 1.75 rushing touchdowns allowed per game. I think it's still going to be good for Notre Dame, but I just want to throw out there that's an average number when we look at these advanced stats. Arkansas is giving up touchdowns in the red zone 64.3% of the time, and they're giving up 4.2 yards per carry. Those are all pretty good numbers here for Jeremiah Love. I absolutely love this matchup, no pun intended. I think this is a great matchup here. I like it for Notre Dame. I like it for both of their running backs. I especially like it for Love. Um, I don't know if anyone might have been considering like, hey, should I maybe look somewhere else? I think this is a no-brainer. Throw for Jeremiah Love, Notre Dame. Throw him out there and start him with tons of confidence. Next guy that I'm going to go over here is Jonna Coleman from Washington. They are taking on Ohio State at home. Vegas is calling on Washington to score 22 points. And I know I find this odd. My fantasy matchup grade is a B plus. And I kind of say it every week when I find scores, grades that I give out that I find a bit puzzling. But the way that my scores kind of work out is I take whether it's rushing or passing or rushing. I take the team stats for all teams. I then apply fantasy points to them and I re rank them based on the fantasy points scored or allowed. So, a good example is that heading into this week's game, if you were to pull up who's the top rushing offense in the country, you're going to see Navy if you pull up pure team stats. If you pull that up if you take team stats, apply fantasy points to it, and re rank it by which rushing offenses have scored the most fantasy points, Washington is number one in fantasy rushing offense. So I do my rankings, I start there. So I do this offensively, defensively. I look at where the two teams that are going off rank, compare them that way, and then I kind of have this sliding scale based on how small or how big of a difference there is and what type of grade I give. And it's not a linear scale either. You could be just, let's say, 5 points better than the defense. Those a lot of times produce some of the best fantasy games. Two very competitive teams, but you're slightly better than their defense. A lot of times those games can be way better for you than a blowout against an FCS school. So I kind of, I like that's why I say, depending on how big that gap or how small that gap is between the fantasy ranks that I give all these teams for their offense and defense, it'll kick out a grade, and it's an automated system that I've built. So I was very surprised to see that this is a B plus grade for Washington, and honestly though, that does fit into if I'm Washington. I'm going to have to open up my passing game, but I'm going to have to run the ball to keep that Ohio State offense off the field. So I do think that that is a positive for Coleman here. But if we're just being really honest, I think that's the only positive for Coleman. Well, that and getting to play at home. But I, as a longtime Washington fan, as someone who has watched them for a long time, I can tell you we don't fare well against Ohio State. The best we have ever done was, I think it was 1995 when they came to Husky Stadium. They had Eddie George at running back. I think that game, and then it was the 2019 Rose Bowl, 2018, regular season, um, where Ohio State just jumped out to a massive lead. Then Washington clawed their way back to, if they converted a onside kick in the fourth quarter, they could have had the ball and a chance to take the lead. Those are the only two games I can think of, and I know they're more modern games, but like, we typically we don't match up that great. And really, my assessment of this Washington offense is it's three players doing everything, and Ohio State has too much talent on the field where they're going to be able to take away the three pieces of talent on that Washington offense that's doing all the production. And it gets even scarier when you look into Ohio State's stats. One thing that's an average matchup for Coleman here is that Ohio State is giving up 3.1 yards per carry on the ground. Ohio State did play Texas, but then they played a bunch of MAC schools. So Washington probably can exploit that. Coleman could probably get get some yardage here and there, at a better clip than 3.1 yards. But Texas had a hard time running against him too. So I take that as is, but the numbers that just absolutely scare me, and they're terrible. If you're a Coleman owner, they should scare you too here. Ohio State has given up 0 rushing touchdowns all game, all year, none. And Coleman's been known for getting touchdowns. He might be able to get like to ram in a short yardage touchdown if they manage to hit, some big play to Boston over the top. But I'm going to tell you right now, guys, I think this is a very safe one. Coleman has been one of the hottest players in football this year in CFF. But I'm going to tell you, John Coleman, Washington, sit 'em. The last guy I'm going to go with here is Dominic Richardson, Tulsa, who is taking on Tulane. Vegas is calling on Tulsa to score only 20 points. I've given this a B minus fantasy matchup grade. And when I kind of look at this, there's some things I like and there's some things I don't like. Um, Stuff that I'm not displaying on the screen, things that don't have to do with numbers, but um, I liked the way he outperformed my expectations last week against Oklahoma State. I definitely thought Oklahoma State would play better than they did in that game. But Richardson, I was surprised. Like he could move the ball against a not very good Big 12 defense, but he did much better. Tulsa's a much better team than, excuse me, Tulane is a much better defense, in my opinion, than Oklahoma State was. So, like, I have reservations and I have things just in general that I kind of like and don't like for Richardson here. But getting into the numbers, Tulane is giving up 1.25 rushing touchdowns per game, and they're giving up touchdowns in the red zone 50% of the time. Those are both average numbers for Richardson, and Tulane is giving up 4.8 yards per carry. That is a really good number for Richardson here. The thing that I kind of throw out here, if I go just by the numbers, I would say you should start Richardson, but just have expectations for a lower ceiling this week. My gut, maybe it's just because like I was thinking it last week and it's just still stuck in my head. I'm not sure, guys, but my gut tells me this may not be the best scenario for Richardson. I'm just going to kind of throw out there. I just want to throw out some of this, like, a little bit of cautious in my head, but also I see a lot of good numbers. This was someone I've struggled a little bit with, which is why I wanted to highlight him here. But I'm going to sit there and just say, you know, expect the possibility of a lower ceiling, but against my gut feelings, I'm still going to say, because these advanced stats are pretty good for him, I'm going to say Dominic Richardson, Tulsa, Stardom. All right, I'm going to take a sip of water before we dive into these wide receivers here. All right, start off with a name that I really like. This is another kind of like an obvious, I love this guy this week sort of pick. Makai Lemon, USC against Illinois. And Illinois has looked really good until last week when they got throttled by Indiana. I do not see Illinois playing that bad this week. So I want to throw that out there off the bat. But what I'm see here is Vegas is calling on USC to score 33 and a half points. This is an A minus fantasy grade for me. And I want to say with these advanced stats, I do think that Indiana game has skewed them a little, but I don't think it skewed them because um, they should be a lot lower. I just think that, like, it could be one of those. This just might be around what their stats should be once they get into Big Ten play, and maybe the skewing was the lesser opponents that they played. But with these passing matchups, for Makai Lemon, it's an A minus. That is really good. Illinois, surprisingly, with all the touchdowns Indiana threw, Illinois on the season's only given up 1.75 passing touchdowns per game. That is an average number. These next two numbers are pretty good for Lemon. Illinois is giving up touchdowns in the red zone 63.6% of the time, and they are giving up third down conversions 40.8% of the time. There are a lot of stats here that are looking like like this is going to be super favorable for USC in this matchup. And Jacoby Lane has been dinged up. With him dinged up, Makai Lemon has been stepping up and helping fill that void as well. Something that's really not in the stats, but I think it's definitely worth throwing out there. At the time of recording this, guys, I have not seen if there's been any change in Jacoby Lane's status of being questionable. So I love this one all around. Um, so I'm going to say Makai Lemon, USC, Start Em. Next one here is Decoria Moore, Oregon, taking on Penn State on the road. Probably going to be a whiteout game. Vegas, excuse me. Vegas is calling for Oregon to score 24.5 points. My fantasy matchup grade for this one is a B minus, which is pretty good, but I'm not a fan of some of these next stats. Penn State is only giving up 0.67 passing touchdowns per game. They are only giving up touchdowns in the red zone 33.3% of the time. That is really bad. And the third down conversion rate is average at 34.8%. Um, One thing that I just like when I kind of look at this game through my coach's lens, um, you've got Oregon traveling 3 time zones. We do know that does take an effect on teams in the Big Ten. Oregon, who when they had to travel 2 time zones to Illinois and have an early kickoff, they didn't look as crisp as they have. And one thing that I look about with this Oregon team, they're very young. Like the guys that they really need to count on, there's some guys here and there that have some experience, but there's other ones that kind of don't. And Decoria Moore, he's still getting his feet wet his freshman year here, and Dante at quarterback. I don't know how well both of them are going to do in this matchup on the road at Penn State against a team who I think, now that I've seen what I've seen out of Texas, like I kind of think Penn State is maybe my favorite to win the national championship this year. We'll definitely get a good definitely get a good look at it this week, guys. But my gut is just telling me, and this projected score of only 24.5 points for Oregon, I don't think there's enough touchdown opportunities to go around for Decoria Moore. The one thing that I will say that I like about him is that he is a guy who could pop off a big play at any time and take it to the house. Um, but that also can really hurt you as a fantasy owner because you keep wanting to leave him in your lineup even in bad matchups because you're thinking, well, even if he gets 4 receptions, he could still get a 70-yard touchdown in there and make it manageable. And it's a rough one here. I mean, I just think this might just need to be, even if you are leaning on that sort of hope, I think that when it comes to Decoria Moore, Oregon, play it safe, sit them. My last guy, I really like. Well, like as soon as I saw these passing this passing matchup, I got a lot higher on this passing game than a lot of people will think for this week. But I'm going to go Kevin Coleman, Missouri, taking on UMass. Another thing that why I kind of liked with this here, before I dive into things, like just everyone's expecting the Missouri running game to just plow through, to do all the damage against UMass. And I think they're going to definitely do some. Sorry, I had to take another sip. I'm not, I definitely think that running game is going to get a lot of work. But I also kind of think that what's probably going to happen here is that you're not going to see a heavy pass workload in the game plan, but they're still going to have to pass. They still got to be their offense. They still are putting some things on film, but like not as much. But I think they're going to be ridiculously big play minded when they're making plays in the air. And so I'm finishing up my assessment of what I think this Missouri offense will probably do, leading into talking about what Vegas thinks in this one, because Vegas is calling on Missouri to score 50 points. So there are enough touchdowns to go around to get at least 2 in the air. And every single advanced stat I'm going to go over is really good, except for the red zone touchdown conversion rate. That one's only pretty good. But I'm just going to kind of go rapid fire down the line here. Fantasy matchup grade A. Passing defensive touchdowns allowed per game 4. Red zone touchdown conversion rate, 64.3%. Third down conversion rate, 54.8%. This matchup is, this might be the best fantasy passing matchup of any team I've seen all season here. So Coleman's one of those guys, he might only get 4 receptions, but this might be a game where it's 4 receptions for 120 yards and 1 touchdown. I just, this is probably someone that if you have him on your team, you just haven't really thought about putting anyone from the Missouri passing game in your lineup. But I wanted to share these advanced stats. They scream, Missouri making big plays and finding fantasy production here. So I'm wrapping up the receivers with Kevin Coleman, Missouri, Start Em. Now for the tight ends, I'm going to do another sip of water. And I'm going to start things off with a player who started the year hot, and then he's just kind of had a couple of dud games here. But Dorian Thomas from New Mexico, he is taking on in-state rival New Mexico State. We have Vegas calling on New Mexico to score 34 points. The fantasy matchup grade in this one is a C, which is average, if we all remember from school. Defensive passing touchdowns allowed is only 1. That's kind of bad. Red zone touchdown conversion rate, 44.4%. Kind of bad. The only thing really, there's 2 things going for Dorian Thomas if you're trying to think about making him your tight end play. Vegas is calling on 34 points. I do like that. And New Mexico State is giving up third downs 44.2% of the time. That's pretty good. The problem I see is that the rushing matchup for New Mexico is tremendously better, and New Mexico's running the ball well right now. I don't know how much Dorian Thomas is going to be needed, and when you have when you have this passing matchup where Mexico State is pretty decent here, I have a hard time picturing Dorian Thomas getting enough targets and then getting enough receptions from those targets to make him worth your while to put him in your lineup. And I'm one of those guys, I spent a pretty good amount of money in the Kings Classic to get Dorian Thomas after week 1 because I'm like, ooh, a guy from New Mexico popped off against Michigan and they're feeding him a ton of targets. Give me some of that. But I'm just going to tell you, I realized this in the Kings Classic and I want to share it with you guys too. Because like, if you guys got Dorian Thomas, you're probably like me. He's been sitting on your bench. You're just waiting for that game. You can put him in there, and you're going to see another big performance. But this week, I'm going to say Dorian Thomas, New Mexico, sit him. I'm going to transition over to one of my favorite games of the week. Dan Villari, Syracuse versus Duke. Right now, Vegas is calling on Syracuse to score 27.5 points. Syracuse is putting in Ricky Collins at quarterback because Angeli is injured and out for the year. For any of you that weren't really following much news in the spring or the summertime, Ricky Collins was the leading quarterback throughout all of spring camp. Like the week of the spring game, the coaches announce they say he is our starting quarterback. They sit him out of the spring game, and then a week or 2 later, they sign Angeli, and Angeli comes into fall camp and wins the job. I'm rehashing that for you guys because Ricky Collins, even though he's going to be taking over at quarterback, one thing to see here is that the coaches did have faith with him back in the spring. They did like him. At the same time, it is going to be his first start. I do think that there's some hesitation there, and something that's not on the screen and that I do want to cover is that people are running all over Duke, and especially when it comes to where Duke's giving up touchdowns is way more in favor on the ground than in the air. So I see a number of interesting things with this matchup here when it comes to different Syracuse players. And at tight end, since we're talking about Villari, we're talking about the passing matchup here, and I give that passing matchup an A minus. So I love the ability for Syracuse to move the ball on this Duke defense in the air, but Duke has only given up 1.25 passing touchdowns per game. That is an average number. What I do like is that Duke has given up touchdowns in the red zone 72.2% of the time. That's really, really good. But like I said, most of those touchdowns are all coming on the ground. And we know that Syracuse has a good running back who can take advantage of that. Third down conversion rate here is 45.5%, which is pretty good. The big thing I'm going to kind of throw out there, because as tight ends, we kind of have to evaluate them a little differently. I think Valari can be a good asset for you here. I think he's going to get targets and yards. I just don't think you can hold your breath that he's going to score a touchdown in this one, guys. Something tells me the ground game may steal all of those. And Ricky Collins can also run. So Ricky Collins, along with Yasin Willis, can both steal those rushing touchdowns. So I want to throw out that caution there. I like Dan Villari, Syracuse. I'm saying start him. Just don't hold your breath on a touchdown, guys. The next one I'm going to throw out here is a guy that I've been highlighting on my waiver wire targets article for 2 weeks now, who I really like. That is Dalen Bentley from Utah. Utah. I'm going to take a sip of water. Dalen Bentley from Utah. He is taking on West Virginia. Vegas is calling on Utah to score 30 points. This is a B- fantasy matchup grade from me. And looking at the West Virginia defense, they're giving up 1.25 passing touchdowns per game. That's average, but some numbers that might scare you off of Bentley. West Virginia has only given up touchdowns in the red zone 33.3% of the time. And their third down conversion rate is 28.3% of the time. That third down conversion rate is kind of bad. That red zone touchdown conversion rate is really bad. But this is something I talk about a lot, and I'm going to keep reiterating it because I'm sometimes getting people that come across my show during the year and they're new. One thing that's unique to the tight end position in college fantasy football is that when you have a tough matchup, when there are things that don't always look good, those are the games that you tend to see the tight end position leaned on more. You know, when you have a great matchup, sometimes it depends on the offensive system. That's another thing too. But like if you're going to blow out a team, sometimes the tight ends just never get involved. So a tough matchup like this against a good team like West Virginia, yes, I know they lost to Ohio, but they're still a tough team. A tough defense here. I think that this is one of those perfect games that you look for where Vegas is still calling for 30 points. There's still scoring opportunities, and it's still a B- passing grade, passing matchup grade. So like I see the positive lining there in some bad advanced matchup stats, but that's part of what tells me, okay, this is a good matchup, competitive matchup with Utah passing, West Virginia pass defense, but Utah probably has a little bit of an edge there. So despite the fact that it may not look that appealing at first glance, I'm going to say Dalen Bentley, Utah, start him. All right, guys. We're wrapping up the show here, and I'm just kind of moving my little things around. But that was my selections for this week's Start Em Sit 'Em podcast episode. Each week, I mentioned this before, each week I post a thread on X and Substack asking for you to submit your start sit questions that I can answer. If you want help with your lineups, please join in that discussion. Submit your questions to me. And if you jump over to letpurplerain.com, that is where I will answer your questions. I have a link in the description below. So if you're watching this on YouTube or listening on Spotify, you can click over. It'll take you to my article on letpurplerain.com. And you just scroll down, and that's where you'll find the submitted question video here. I want to help you guys. I say this all the time. My goal is to help you win a fantasy championship in 2025. Give me your questions. Let me help you get across that finish line. You've been listening to the Start Em Sit 'Em episode here. Please follow on YouTube and Spotify. Thanks for joining the Let Purple Rain podcast. Your CFF Rain starts here.